All right. Welcome back, everyone, to another Learning Tech Talks, where we are living at the landscape of business, technology, and the human experience. I'm looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to be talking about personalization in the AI world and what that looks like when it comes to pulling together a technology ecosystem, as well as a few other fun things. I'm looking forward to it. So I am joined by Helen Marshall from Thrive, and she's going to be navigating this conversation with me. And it is the end of the day for you, Helen. So for those who aren't aware, where are you located right now?
So I'm near Derby in the United Kingdom, and I'm going to give you a warning straight up now. It is the summer holidays. The kids are downstairs in the background, so anything could happen.
I never accept apologies for personal interruptions, whether it's on my live stream or my meetings or anything, because as a father of 7, it would be hypocritical of me to tell anyone it's rude to interrupt things for personal reasons. So don't worry about it at all. There's, background noise. They come busting through the door. I'll welcome it. We'll bring them on stage. They can join the
Oh,
conversation.
don't encourage them. They don't need encouraging.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that from the AI personalization standpoint. But for those who may not be familiar with you, so you're the CLO at Thrive, but you are very active in the industry. So little background into you and your journey into the space.
Sure, yeah. So as you say, my role is Chief Learning Officer at Thrive, which is quite a unique role, I think, from vendor side, at least within the industry. So what that means from a business perspective is that I almost act as a bit of a golden thread of what best practice looks like for us
Okay.
as a product in the industry, and voicing that to external audiences, so our customers and then the wider L&D industry. So I would summarize my role as I guess
Because
trust
chief learning
building.
officer in the tech space, well, at least on the vendor side, it's a unique role because you
Mhm.
have just as much kind of almost public presence responsibility as you do kind of that learning best practice and expertise.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when it's more of an internal role, leading the learning strategies for businesses is where we normally see that role sit within the customers that we certainly work with. And from a vendor perspective, I think, well, Thrive always like to do things a little bit differently. So bringing someone in from that kind of thought leadership position to share that knowledge with the with wider audiences, but also to leverage that for our customers to say, look, we know what's going on in the industry, and this is why we do things in a certain way, and this is how you can benefit from doing X, Y, Z. So it really works well from that perspective. But from outside of my direct role, I also set up a group called Women In, which brings together women from across the L&D space and HR, and probably further afield once we continue to grow. And the idea there is that really we wanted to build a community to bring people together. We were definitely hearing from various different sources across L&D that there was this distinct lack of a safe space for women to get together and share mainly best practice, seek advice, gain support.
Okay.
So yeah, set that up.
And is it specific to learning and development? I mean, obviously that may be the category of folks who are kicking around in there, but is that the topics that you're discussing, or is it really more just the safe space to talk about careers, things like that?
Yeah, good question, because I
Or
think
all
it's
of the
really
above, I guess.
yeah, mixture of all of that, really. What we're seeing is a lot of people who work in very small L&D teams or as solopreneurs coming to the group to seek advice, to bounce ideas off each other, and to ask for advice about wider programs or facilitation techniques or really practical kind of key takeaway actions. But then
Okay.
conversely, talking about, well, I'm going to apply for this job. How do you think I should approach this? Or is it right based on my skill set? Can we mentor each other? Can we coach each other? So that the biggest thing for me is when people meet on the group and then go somewhere else and talk and build those connections and keep the community growing in that way. And that's
Okay.
happened, and continues to happen as well.
Now, how long, out of curiosity, how long ago did you start that?
So kick that off. I've been thinking about it probably this time last year. And really thinking, I'm hearing these noises from people. I'm having various conversations with people, and there's a commonality in the conversations I'm having. So I thought I want to do something about this, but I'm I suppose, my own worst enemy, in that when I think about an idea, I start to want to do it perfectly first time. So I'm like, right, what can I do, and how do I build it, and what does it need to look like, and what's it going to look like a year down the line? And then so it got to Christmas, and I still hadn't done anything about it because I didn't. I
Finally,
was caught in action. So yeah, Christmas time, I thought, that's it. I'm just going to start a WhatsApp group, and it just snowballed from there. So now we have about 500 members. We've got our own platform that's powered by Thrive. And we're starting to do kind of more local meetups. We have monthly events, and it's always growing. I think the thing I've learned about running a community is that no one really knows what they're doing when they're running a community, and it's really based off the feedback of the people in it that makes it work.
It's funny you talk about that, because, and the reason I wanted to dive into it a little bit was that sense of belonging that people need. It existed long before the pandemic, but I feel like these past few years, especially, this need to be able to connect with folks and figure, and like you said, knowing what that looks like anybody who's like, I know exactly how to run a community, is like, I don't know that anybody really knows exactly how to do it, because you're figuring it out as you go. And that's one of the beauty and challenges of a community, is it's organic in the way it grows and changes and what's important to people. And if you can't flex with that, if you're very like, this is exactly how it is, I mean, you can, but it loses, I think, some of its stickiness when you treat it that way.
And I'm very conscious that I'm just one person that noticed these commonalities and conversations. What actually the community needs to serve the community. So we're basing the development now on direct feedback from what people are saying they need and they want. And it's been very I guess humbling to be part of the community itself, and to see it grow, and to hear the positive noise that comes out of it.
Well, and it's funny, so when I started the Learning Sharks community, it was a similar type thing where I just had so many one-off. So my vision behind it was, I just had all these one-off messages where people would reach out and ask me a question, and I would see these patterns of, I'm getting the same question from 15 different people. Obviously, there's a need for people to understand this stuff, but I only have so much capacity to try and support everybody individually. And so mine originally started as a Slack channel where, again, it was just a place to democratize knowledge, bring people together and say, hey, how can we support each other? Because L&D can be a very lonely place. And you talked about it. There's a lot of folks who maybe don't sit in part of a large centralized organization, or they're the one man or woman band out kind of taking care of things. And it can be very lonely and difficult in an industry where everybody thinks, all your stakeholders think they know what you do, and they think they know better than you do. And you're trying to figure out, like, how do I navigate this? And it can be very lonely.
Yeah, and I think also that people that are maybe even part of larger organizations gets that there's a tendency to think very in a very insular way about what L&D looks like for that business, and it then becomes even more imperative to look beyond the bubble of your organization to figure out what's going on in the wider community and be part of that wider community. And that's why I think things like LinkedIn are so useful, to keep people connected, but also to have that awareness of what's going on, and keep up to date with the latest trends. But the other thing I would say about community is that we're hearing quite often from a customer perspective how important communities are when they're actually delivering learning now. So I think that's, I don't want to say it's a buzzword, because I feel like community has always been an effective way to learn, and people learn through communities in a very social way. But actually, we're seeing. So I'll give you an example of from a Thrive perspective. One of the products we offer is Content Club, and as part of that, we're developing some leadership content. And we did a focus group with senior leaders from various different customers, and the overwhelming response was, we actually want a community to share ideas about what good leadership looks like, from organizations outside their own to make sure that they're doing the correct things and applying it in the way that their organization needs to. But really, community was the thing that came out of that, and we're hearing it kind of left, right, and center from in different situations. So I think it's becoming, and again, maybe that's as a result of the pandemic putting it into focus in more detail, but it's important.
No, I mean, as far back as I can go, that has always been a thing, right? It may not had that term. I think that's the thing. That term became a bit of a buzzword come COVID. Community was everybody was starting a community. Everybody had a new community. This had a community, that had a community. And it kind of it became so ubiquitous, kind of became like people didn't really even know what that was. But to your point, people have always wanted that connection to others with similar interests, things like that, where they want to grow and develop together, and they want to invite folks from different perspectives and different angles to come work through that together. And it's a really important part of learning. I think it's really important part of just our existence, but I think in learning especially, this is where you go from, well, I have these ideas in my head to, well, but how do I pressure test these? And who else has learned from these? And who else has walked this path? And what things worked for them and what things didn't? And there's a deep desire for people to have that and to have that sense of belonging in that.
Yeah, and it's that storytelling piece as well, of that the experience that people can bring to the table, and the application in different situations of information that might be relevant to one individual, but bringing it into a different situation and framing it in a different way. It's just really useful, and I think that, yeah, just the storytelling piece is powerful. We hear about it all the time from a learning design perspective in content creation. Make sure you're telling the right stories, but it's probably actually quite challenging to do that with text-based content, which I guess sounds counterintuitive when we're thinking about actually writing stories. But from bringing people along on a journey, how do you do that? How do you bring it to life? And it's that kind of experience angle, I think, that's community.
Well, but I think to your point, but it doesn't necessarily, and this is where sometimes when I look at some of these things, we tend to approach them from a very binary perspective of like, well, is text good or bad, or is, community good or bad? And it's like, well, it's just, like they're both needed. I think of how old are book clubs? I mean, really, when you think about a book club, what was a book club? It was a community. You got together, you read a book, and it was text-based, but then you came together in community and you discussed it, and you brought that together, and you brought these ideas. Because going back to, and this, if you think this is a sidebar, it's actually not, because this all ties back to personalization. Because what you're really doing through community is personalizing things in ways that you couldn't without the community. A book is one thing, but everybody reads it through a different lens. Different things stand out, different components really resonate with one person, not someone else. And the way you bring those things to light and actually spread it is in community.
Yeah, and everyone, and I think this is, as I do more events and I create more events and bring people together in different ways, what I'm noticing, and I suppose maybe just haven't paid attention to enough in the past, is how different everyone's experience of a particular thing is going to be. So yes, you're all focused on a central idea, and you're being brought together for a particular reason, but creating a space like the Women in Community on WhatsApp gives you that ability to collect all that information and feedback based on an event and see, well, actually, that person took this away from that, and this person took that away from it. It's a very practical way of understanding, putting yourselves in the shoes of the learner in that perspective. So thinking, how is an individual going to be approaching whatever it is that you're creating, whatever it is that you're rolling out. We have an expectation, I think, certainly from a learning design perspective, that's maybe we've fallen down on in the past, that people are going to take away exactly what you want them to from a situation, which is just very difficult to put I guess, ring fence and say, we know for sure someone's going to do this, because people, it's just impossible to know what someone's going to do, or how someone's going to react, or how someone's even going to interpret based on their own situation, their own environment, what you've created. And that is something we just need to pay more attention to, I think. And that comes back to the fundamentals of how people learn and
Yes.
how we set people up to learn effectively at the end of the day.
Well, and I think in many regards, this is where digital learning, I use those in air quotes, got a really bad rap, because what happened was we stripped out the community from learning, and we completely sanitized a lot of learning from community. And so going back to it, I mean, it doesn't matter how great your objectives are, write them all you want, to be able to say, here's what I'm hoping you walk away from this experience from. No matter how well crafted that experience, absent community, you have no way of actually guaranteeing that someone's experience, based on even their attitude that day, something is going to jump out to them based on, I had a rough morning, or I had an argument with my spouse, or something like is just going to shape the way they go through that experience in that moment. And when you lack the community to actually give people an opportunity to engage and participate with other people, you're actually robbing them of a lot of things. And I think that's where you see, post pandemic, you see some of these kind of like drive back to in person, which isn't necessarily bad, but I think it's almost an overcorrection of recognizing what really was missing that wasn't included.
Yeah, you know what's been interesting recently is I've noticed with a couple of customers that I've spoken to, that there's almost a hesitancy to mention in-person training. It's almost like, oh, we're still doing that, or oh, we're thinking about doing it. And actually, it's great thinking about that blended approach, like you mentioned earlier, and how you create an experience for someone. It just matters that you're delivering it in the right way at the right time. It doesn't really matter what format that takes. But it's really interesting, that kind of shift from, oh, everything needs to be digital, let's get everything online, without really thinking about the experience that you're creating for people. And then the fallout of that is people now saying, oh, I'm not really sure that I should be mentioning in-person training. I feel like everything should be digital, but it just doesn't.
Right, like it's 2023. That's not socially acceptable to say that we're doing any of that anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important that platforms have that kind of social learning element as a key focus, because that is the creating that community, essentially, is that understanding of what good knowledge is looking like within a business, and how often people are sharing those kind of engagement stats, I suppose, which are often seen as vanity metrics, but they're really fundamental to understanding, like, for example, the way that we use social media and understand how to choose a video of, I don't know, how to put up a shelf on YouTube based on the amount of likes or comments that are on the video. The same way that learning platforms can leverage that social reinforcement, and then identify, and this is where I think it goes a step further than just those vanity metrics, identifying individuals within your business who are able to then become a subject matter expert, or are subject matter experts, and they become that influence and champion of knowledge within your business. And I think that's where I really see the benefit of platforms, well, obviously like Thrive, that have that element in there, and who can continue to identify good strong content based on the reactions of others within the community. And the other side of that is the production of content as well. So it's really empowering for individuals to be given the opportunity to share whatever it is they have, whether that's a skill related to their job or something that they've observed in others and they want to share and pass on knowledge to other people. And so, yeah, that extending community in that way in a digital environment, I think, is something that is really positive. But as we said, it doesn't always need to rely on digital content to fulfill whatever it is that you're trying to do. And I think it's creating a space where you can think about that wider experience, both on and offline.
Well, and what you're talking about, I think, whether you're talking about learning experiences and the components of that, or, the metrics that you may look at to, measure effectiveness in this, they're all, we're talking about storytelling, but all stories have different components. And it's not that some components are more important than other components. Like, oh, your plot is more important than your characters. Like, well, what? No, you have to have a good plot and you have to have good characters. You don't pick one and then get rid of the rest. You have to actually figure out how these things fit together in concert to ultimately create something meaningful. And I think that's true whether you're talking about the way you structure a learning experience and say, what are we really trying to do here? And what are the components that we need? One of the most frustrating things I'll run into every once in a while is when I'll be in a situation where a decision has been made that something needs to be done digitally or in person, either way. But that decision has been made absent the what are we really trying to do here and what is the best way to construct that experience, rather than, we're deciding based on what box we think it needs to fit into, rather than saying, what are we trying to do? And then let's build a box around that, which again, like I said, some of this stuff may sound like we're on a bit of a rabbit trail, but really this all ties back to what is personalization? Because that word gets thrown around all the time. We need to personalize. If you don't understand what you mean when you say personalize, how can you possibly accomplish that?
Yeah, I think and that's something that I've certainly seen regularly associated with AI as well, in that I think it's an easy way for people to suggest that they're using AI on their platforms to personalize the learning experience, when actually the technology that's being used to surface content to an individual is not necessarily using AI. It just might look like it is. And so, I mean, let's take learning technologies, and I know we spoke about this before we went live.
Yeah.
My experience of being there in May was that a lot of learning vendors were kind of jumping on this AI bandwagon. Obviously, ChatGPT really took the world by storm, and I'm going to say beginning of the year,
100 million users in a week. It has that kind of effect.
Yeah. And so, all of a sudden we're seeing all these experts pop up and all these platforms that are suddenly saying, we actually, we use AI. We just forgot to tell you about it. And now, we're in the moment where we can share it with you and we can attract people to our stand. So that's what we're doing. And I think I counted all of the different seminars that were going on across the exhibition floor, and including the conference, although I think there's definitely more of a place for AI in the conference because it's more obviously geared towards that thought leadership piece. Arguably, that's my opinion. On the seminar floor, on the exhibition floor, we were seeing that maybe 20% of all of the seminar titles had AI in the title.
Which was funny on the practitioner side, because I'm in a lot of circles with folks who, they're coming from the practitioner side. And I remember when that event happened, I was in a number of conversations post and just, asked people what they thought and what their experience was. And the feedback was very similar. AI was so ubiquitous. It was impossible to it's like, that's the only thing people were talking about. But the interesting thing listening to people talk about it was they said the word was thrown around a lot, but it wasn't really used in any sort of meaningful way. It was just stated as though everyone knows what we're talking about. And there wasn't even a real confidence that are the people saying the words even confident in what they're talking about when they're saying it. And that was kind of the impression everybody left, just going, I know less about artificial intelligence having left that event than I did going into it, because I'm like, I don't even know what's going on anymore. It's just everything is being tagged as AI, and I don't even know what people mean.
That's the feeling everyone has when they leave learning technologies, right? I don't know what's going on anymore. You're baffled by the sensory overload of being in that space.
Everything I thought I knew about the world is different. Yeah.
But yeah, like I definitely felt that. And what was really interesting, I think, from a Thrive perspective, is that it really gave us the chance to think and be considerate about how we're going to be approaching this as a business. And rather than jumping on the bandwagon with everyone else immediately, we actually just stopped to consider. We thought, what are people going to be saying about their products? Is it going to be true? What are some of the interesting things that we can see other people doing that we think have got kind of legs to stand on? And I feel like that's kind of setting us apart a little bit in the vendor space, because I feel like we're being more considerate about how we need to approach this and what the implications really are from an administrator's perspective using our platform, but then from the learner perspective, because ultimately what we're trying to do is make people's lives easier, to allow them to learn more effectively and to upskill and to access information when they need it. So taking that step back was very useful, I think, in order to allow us the time to formulate that plan and to think about what it is that we need to do. But you know what? I feel like it was also quite scary in that, because AI and the talk around it is moving so rapidly, so fast, it was quite scary to be that considerate about something that's happening so quickly. And even a couple of months, which usually is nothing, which is usually a long period of
like
time
a
to
lifetime.
consider. Yeah, you know, it's that kind of what's happened. Like, so much more has happened in the past, since March, since ChatGPT was started, like, I guess, being embedded more commonly in people's everyday lives.
Oh yeah,
But it's an
I
exciting
mean, you
time.
see it literally everywhere now. Which Shilpa asked this early on in the conversation. This will kind of tie to where we're going with it. You know, the question about whether it's OpenAI or some of these other tools out there that are looking at this stuff. Somebody asked a question on a post I had yesterday about this, and my response back is, I think the limit to what the possibilities are our imagination. I don't think we've even started to scratch the surface on the possible use cases of this. And that's where I get disappointed sometimes, where I see what we're doing with it, because I'm like, that's that's how far you're stretching your imagination. But I think, to your point, there is this pressure right now, not only just on vendors, but I think on practitioners. I think on a lot of people, where it's just like, well, everybody's doing it, so I got to figure out how to do something with it. And
Mm-hmm.
then that action bias kicks in to just go, well, let me just grab the first thing that comes to mind, or let me just glom onto something so that I can say I'm part of the. And again, it's funny, this ties back to our sense of belonging that we were talking about with community, where there's this
Mm-hmm.
feeling of like, well, I want to fit in. I want to be part of the crowd that everybody's talking about AI. How do I belong with this group of people? So I guess I'll just grab something. And that can be one of the biggest mistakes you can make. And I caution a lot of people right now, be very careful how quickly you're rushing in to throw AI at something just because you can, or someone
Yeah,
else did, or someone else said they are.
but I think I'd always encourage a culture of experimentation. So seeing how something
Yes.
works, and then changing. You know, if it's working, great. But I think the way that people are using. So I'm going to use generative AI as an example, because that's how people are most commonly using AI in their daily lives at the moment. And I guess there's that kind of overlay of chat GPT, in that you can use it as a knowledge base and input information and search for it based on the parameters in which you set. And that's kind of an immediate use. But like you say, it's not necessarily stretching. We're not stretching our imaginations to think about that, because it's a use that we already have within our daily lives, that we've seen kind of an
Yep.
immediate solution or fix for. But the thing that I really struggle with, is I was actually having a chat with someone earlier around this, is that it's a little bit like space, in that you cannot physically fathom the possibilities of the impact that it's going to have on our daily lives. And I know that I don't have the brain to think so innovatively about this technology that it's going to revolutionize the way that we do something. I just know I don't have that capability in me. It's going to be the real geniuses in the world that really have that out of the box thinking, or the people that just are used to thinking in such a creative way. And that's as equally as exciting as it is scary. And I think a lot of to the question that you just had on screen, how is it affecting the learning industry? I think there's a couple of ways to respond to this. And I think there's, from the practical tool perspective of how is the learning industry adopting the tools that we currently have available? How is it utilizing technology that already has AI embedded, and adopting, and therefore adapting the technology based on its understanding of what's available and what the parameters could be? But then from a skills perspective, I'm definitely seeing that L&D teams don't necessarily have a thorough understanding of what AI is. This goes back to, obviously, our conversation around what learning technologies taught us, and what it didn't
Yeah.
teach us. And how is that lack of understanding going to impact the decisions that we make about what we definitely need within an organization or what we don't need? And I saw a post earlier by Craig Weiss, who obviously an industry analyst, about his service that he's offering to go into organizations and talk about AI. What do you need from AI? What products do you need? How can you formulate an AI strategy? And that is really worrying to me from again, from that community aspect of the industry of L&D, is that this type of, if someone does have that knowledge and that capability to guide people's thoughts and decision making, surely that information should be freely offered to a wider community in order to upskill as many people as fast as possible in a time when we just don't have the resource or time to commit to upskilling rapidly. That we're then putting a barrier in place and saying, actually, you need to pay to access this knowledge and this information, is going to have a serious detrimental effect on the skills of the L&D community. And that to me is really worrying. So I would say that people, and I see people doing this in a really positive way across the industry, are people like Ross Stevenson, who puts up little videos of, here's how to use ChatGPT to do this, or this is how you could use something. And that is enabling L&D teams to think, actually, I'm going to take that information and I'm going to utilize it in my job. And that sort of information is just, it's invaluable at the moment to L&D teams that are under pressure, that are under resourced, that don't have the budget to bring in an outside resource to share that guidance.
Well, and I think the unfortunate part with this is another unfortunate part, going back to your point about the need to democratize and help raise the tide for the whole community, is, the scarcity mindset can creep in and folks can go, but if I do that, then there won't be enough. And the thing is, the pace at which this is moving. I mean, if you've listened to me talk about artificial intelligence 2 weeks ago, I can tell you right now, it's changed in those 2 weeks. And the way I'm seeing new things and some of the projects I'm involved in and conversations I'm having and how advanced the technology is just changing, it's moving that quick. And so the idea that anybody's going to be able to keep up, we actually almost a requirement of our industry being able to keep pace, of any hope of keeping pace, is actually to democratize that, for us to be effective, because it is moving faster than I think most people even realize. Like you said, you go to Learning Technologies, that was however many months ago, probably most of what was shared there is like,
yeah. And I think it's that pace of change, which, I mean, we all know that L&D has historically been very slow to change and is still very slow to change and to adapt in many ways. And so the pace, I think one positive spin on this is that because of that, how rapidly AI has come about, how it's challenging us to think differently about the way that we do things, the products that we might create, the ways that we might design. It's actually encouraging us to think faster about other elements of what we do, which I think can be a positive. But I would also caution that just because you can think quickly and do something doesn't mean you should necessarily do it.
right.
There's always that kind of step back of, why are we doing something? Who are we doing it for? What are the outcomes that we're looking to achieve? And without kind of just jumping on a bandwagon and saying, look at us, we've got AI. The one thing actually I think that is interesting is we're seeing in a lot of the RFPs that we're receiving from customers, queries around what do you do with your product with AI? And there's no kind of reasoning to that. It's just
It's a new box. It's a new box on the RFP checklist.
Yeah. And if you then dig into that conversation with people, that maybe the answer is that they need something specific, but more often than not, I think it's just a test of the forward-thinking nature of your company, rather than a practical application of the moment there and then of what they actually need. So there's a different way to frame that. But yeah, it's really interesting that that should appear. I think it says a lot, I think, about the way
it's well, and two things. One, I think going back to something you said a little bit earlier that ties to Shilpa's question and those, who are out there. I mean, I highly encourage, in fact, my own teams and the folks that I talk to regularly. I'm like, definitely be experimenting with things. Be trying things out and experimenting with the possibilities. Because even if something is a little bit clunky today, an update might come out next week that radically changes some of that stuff. And that can feel really overwhelming. But I think it goes back to thinking about it with an experimental mindset and going, listen, now is not the time to go head first into the deep end and go, okay, everything we do is now going to be built on XYZ tool. Because in this stage right now, XYZ tool may look wildly different next month than it does right now. And it's not necessarily the time to double down on some of this stuff, while at the same time recognizing it's important to continue experimenting with that stuff. But I think to your point on the RFP, and I think this is something to the practitioners who listen and watch this, your point about the AI now becoming a checkbox on an RFP rather than part of the dialogue of, so how do does AI enhance this capability? You're talking about a separate capability and then the possibility of where AI may enhance that for scale, speed, other things like that. I think the risk of that is it's putting additional artificial pressure on vendors to have to commit the crime that we're saying is actually causing problems. Because it's like, well, now we have to say our thing has AI, because if we don't, then we get rejected in an RFP simply because of some arbitrary checkbox that goes, well, this company doesn't have AI, they said.
It's a vicious circle, because I feel like it's that lack of knowledge and understanding of what AI actually is and where it should fall within your product discussions, like you're saying. And then obviously, as you say, rightly say, that the reaction to that is us saying, oh no, we actually need to do something about this because we're getting requests for it. But actually, are those requests coming from the right place? And then, who's in the wrong then, or who's in the right? So yeah, really interesting development, I think. But it comes back to, I think then the onus falls on us as vendors to ask the right questions, to identify whether we are then a right fit for that company based on the questions that they're asking. Because ultimately what we don't want to do as a vendor is partner with someone who isn't going to be a great fit and has different expectations than our product delivers, because it's just going to be a bad experience for everybody. So ultimately we need to be really digging into that ask and saying, well, why is it that you're asking that? And that, again, that comes back to building reputation and building trust with people, that if you're not asking those questions, if you're not building that relationship during the RFP process and during the sales process, then it doesn't stand you in good stead for an implementation if you're not being given the right information at the right time, or asking the right questions. And I think that's something that Thrive just do so well, is that really digging into and understanding the needs of the customers that come to us asking for certain things, and being able to qualify out leads and say, actually, you should go to go and speak to someone else because they're probably a better fit for you. And we actually take pride in those situations of saying, actually, go and look at one of our competitors because they're going to be better suited,
better fit.
Yeah.
Well, and kudos to and again, not to knock on folks who have jumped on the AI bandwagon, in the sense that I have seen and am very familiar with, as you can imagine, I talk to a lot of vendors and there are some that have legitimately the opportunity to merge artificial intelligence with what they were doing. It was perfect. And what happened with OpenAI and GPT-4 was such a perfect inflection of like, holy cow, we've been waiting to be able to do this. And it truly now enables that. There are plenty of those out there that I'm like, man, they nailed it. It was like the folks who jumped on the virtual, like remote work thing right when the pandemic hit, and they didn't realize it, but it was like, boom, it happened to propel their thing. But kudos to you for, and Thrive, really the leadership there, for recognizing, for us, the right decision is to be more thoughtful and intentional about what we do with it. Because I think that's props for doing that, because I think there was a lot, and still is a lot, of artificial pressure that if you want to be in the cool kids club, you got to say you're the AI, you got the AI wizard type thing. And I think being willing to say, we will, it's not that we're saying we don't see the value or the importance. That's not what we're saying. But what we're saying is we want to be thoughtful and intentional about how and where we use it to create a better product, not simply to check a box on an RFP.
Exactly that. And I think that what's really exciting for us now as a business is seeing those ideas starting to come to fruition and thinking about, well, we've had this practical time period of analysis of this is what we think we should be doing, and this is what we're seeing in the industry, and we think we're on the right lines now. We'll stand by that, but it's at that exciting time of seeing it come to life now. So yeah, I guess watch this space for whatever's next if you're interested in that element of our platform.
Okay, well, I told you I wouldn't push too hard on that area, but I am curious because the other thing that Thrive, and this is transitioning a little bit on some of the journey of Thrive, because you've been a company that's played, and honestly, the L&D landscape has been a bit tumultuous for a while now. You know, the three-letter acronym, LRS, LXP, LMS, like that whole thing and where things were going. I'm curious how you've seen that space adapt and change, because I still remember when LXP was a non-existent acronym and nobody knew what the heck that was. And now it's almost become so integrated into so many things. You know, I'm curious on the vendor side, what that journey has looked like.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, the idea of acronyms, because like you say, at one point there were just acronyms left, right, and center, and it's hard to know. It's hard as a practitioner to know what it is that I definitely should be looking for. And the thing is that it once you get under the definition of LMS or LXP, you're then able to just identify what it is that you're actually trying to do on a practical level. And so someone who's asking for an LMS might actually be better suited to an LXP or vice versa. But there's
and
still
for a bit, it kind of was the AI conversation where you weren't in the cool kids club unless you could say you were an LXP too. So then everybody was throwing we're an LXP on top of it, and it was like, what? But what do you mean when you say learning experience platform?
I'm gonna suggest that Thrive really coined the term LXP, and we started off that bandwagon for people. Because I guess we see ourselves as the cool kids. We've been the disruptors. We've been suggesting that there's a different way of approaching learning, and that the idea of an LXP then is that experiential point of view, and that you're thinking about how people immediately access a platform and are kind of bought into whatever it is that you have in front of them, and the journey through learning is guided in a very social way. Whereas the LMS elements are still there on our platform. You're still able to do the tracking, to do the compliance, to do those more formal
it's the plumbing in your house. You have to have it.
It has to be there.
You have to have it. You can't get away from it.
Stuff. But then the other side of that, and where we're seeing the real benefit of our product is the crossover between, yes, LMS and LXP, but also the platform being used from a skills development perspective, but also as a comms tool as well. So our USP is that people can come to us for that kind of all-in-one solution. That and also this really ties into starting to work with SMEs who maybe are at the beginning of a journey of implementation, and they might just want the LXP part of whatever it is that we offer. And actually, they then actually decide, oh, actually, we can do comms as well through this platform. And then maybe 2 years down the line, we're going to look at the skills development, a year down the line, whatever it's going to be, look at skills development for our people. And businesses are able to grow with us as a platform as a result of that. So I think that bringing things together in one place is
under one umbrella.
Has been really useful for a lot of customers. And it's interesting to see other vendors in the space either doing similar things or really sticking to their guns and saying, no, we really are the LMS part of this, and we're going to really kind of play into that. So yeah, it's an interesting time, I think, in the market, but one which requires us to be really mindful of how we're bridging that gap for a lot of people. And that's all the way down from kind of the
Yeah.
SMEs, as I mentioned, to enterprise level customers.
Well, and it's interesting having watched the journey. I remember, I don't remember, for a long time, everything kind of spun up and there was a ton of new stuff, and there still is. Like I said, talked to a lot of different vendors in early startup and things like that. And there's still a lot of new innovation coming into this space, but it is interesting to watch as some of the tech that was in that new kind of startup stuff is now being normalized into the broader ecosystem, into kind of consolidation mode. And it is leaving, and this kind of ties back to this personalization conversation, is how organizations are starting to pull things together from a user experience standpoint.
Yeah.
Because especially during the pandemic, there was this mass panic in many regards where people were buying whatever they could find to try and fill gaps. We got this gap, we got to get a thing. We got this gap, we got to get a thing. And in some senses, it was what was needed. Organizations, in some cases, just it was what you had to do. But now, as that's becoming more of a state of, well, this is just the world we live in, now there is this shift to start looking back at that and going, what kind of user experiences did we create when we did this? And in many cases, it was not a great user experience. It was a very clunky, discombobulated user experience, which I personally, my take is there's pros and cons to taking the all in one path. There's pros and cons to taking we're going to have different things and then we're going to bring them together. They just bring different challenges. But I think many, all of a sudden, the pendulum swung to, we just got a whole bunch of stuff. And the time was not spent to actually say, how do we thread this all together into a seamless user experience? And the reckoning has come for many organizations.
Yeah, but it kind of rings true with what we were just saying about AI, right? And that, people didn't take the time to think about how everything pieces together. And people haven't thought about how the implications of AI are going to pan out on whatever it is that they're developing. It's not quite the same. I don't think it's the same impact necessarily, but it's the same premise in that you really need to be thoughtful about how your tech's coming together. And I think in some situations it's very useful, but I'd say maybe in all situations it's useful for organizations to just really take stock of their tech stack and say,
Yeah.
what do we have available? And we've had cases of customers who've had in the double figures of LMSs or LXPs, 33.
Well, let's just say I worked for an organization, and one of the projects that we led was consolidating from over 20 down to 2, was even just like what we were trying to do. And it was a massive exercise.
Yeah, and I always wonder how you end up in a situation like that as an organization. Rapid growth, different siloed departments. I've not been in an organization that worked in that way. I've worked with several who have functioned in that way, but not been part of one. And it's I just feel how challenging it is as an outsider looking in. How must it feel from an end user perspective, or do people even realize, because of how organizations are split, maybe at group level, that might you might not even notice that things like this. It's really interesting, thinking about how an individual within an organization must see the tech that's available to them or not see it, if they're not accessing the things that they need to.
Well, and I think sometimes, when you look at it from an organization standpoint, to your point, sometimes it's size, sometimes it's rapid growth, sometimes it's honestly organizational politics. Someone just wants to do what they want to do, and they're more concerned about their agenda than they are the well-being and experience of the end employee. But this is where in some of these big, massive organizations, it can feel like you work for multiple different companies working in the same company. And that, as you look at some of the data around people's engagement and their overall satisfaction with work, sometimes this stuff gets thrown around like, yeah, we want to improve the user experience. And it's perceived as this squishy, nice to have, pie in the sky, unicorns and sunshine type thing. But really, this actually contributes to business performance and the overall engagement and well-being of your employees, which is what companies are built on. And I think
Mm.
going back to this, we as a species have not done a great job learning from our mistakes in many regards. So we just went through this with the pandemic, like, hey, let's just run at things. We'll figure it out later, and are now starting to recognize, boy, we probably should clean this up. I think we run some of the same risks with AI as let's just run out and figure this out and we'll clean it up later. And it's a lot harder to fix things than it is to break them.
And that the worrying thing for me there with AI is that just the data aspect of it. So what, we're running out and we're giving or accessing all this data or providing more data to talk about chat GPT in particular, giving it information that, do we really know how it's being controlled or what's happening to it afterwards? I don't know. And then I think the thing then, the questions around kind of data ethics and your response, how are you treating information in an ethical manner? If you don't know the answer to that, then that's, it's a worrying place to be. And I don't think a lot of people do. People are still formulating that. But it's things that we just really need to be thinking about as, L&D teams and in the industry. And yeah, it does worry me, that aspect of it, but also I think the monetization aspect of it, again, to come back to our previous point, in that people are always going to try and make money, quick buck off something,
Yep.
and really kind of without thinking about the ethical implications of whatever it is that they're doing. And I know that was something that Mo Gadat mentioned when he recorded his second podcast with Stephen Bartlett, talking about the emergency of AI.
Yep.
And the fact that so many businesses are just making quick money off AI without understanding, without giving thought to the longer term view of it. And really interesting, actually, right at the beginning, you mentioned about when we're talking about community, this idea of establishing human connection. And Mo Gadat in that podcast said that the only thing that's going to remain in, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 years, I don't know what the timescale was that he was talking about, but in the very near future was going to be, everything was going to be changed by AI. The fundamental way of living is going to be changed. Very scary, potentially very scary thoughts, but all that will remain is that, and the fundamental human need for human connection. And I thought that was really interesting because, I mean, I'm very passionate about establishing and building human connection anyway, but hearing that there's this thought that that element is never going to disappear, that it will never be replaced entirely by AI. Stephen Bartlett's response was, well, you just build an artificial girlfriend. And that
Yeah.
will solve
So
the
I've listened to
problems.
that conversation multiple times. I did a response video to it on my YouTube channel because there was a lot to unpack with that. And I actually have one I'm releasing this Thursday. Stephen Bartlett did another conversation with Sam Harris, who is a neuroscientist and philosopher. And they had an interesting conversation, long form, 2 hours. And there's a lot to unpack in it. And I did a response to that because there was some really deep things that I think we do need to think about. And it may sound very esoteric for an L&D person to have to think about this, but it's really not, because when you think about what we do and the role we play in an organization, we have a huge influence over where this goes potentially. And
Absolutely.
going back to, whether we want to talk about skills, whether we want to talk about, what fulfillment at work looks like. The one with Sam Harris, just as kind of a teaser on that, he talks about at some point in the future, will we need to work anymore? And Steven's response back was, well, people want to work for purpose. And Sam's very, I think, accurate response is, but who says purpose at work means having to survive, right? This whole survival, having to earn enough to be able to eat. And it's just there's a lot that we have to unpack with this, but I think underneath all of that is the importance of what really will remain is this whole human connection. And the thing that's interesting is that I still, going back to kind of the just binary tendency we have towards things, is I don't see artificial intelligence in competition with our humanity.
Mm-hmm.
It can be. And I think one of the biggest risks of artificial intelligence is that we use it to dehumanize people. And that is the absolute worst thing that we could ever do with it. Whenever
Mm-hmm.
you look back at human history, whenever we dehumanize people with things, it doesn't go well.
No.
But I think there's capabilities of it that can bring out aspects of our humanity that have gone untapped.
Yeah, for sure. We can leverage it to improve the human experience ultimately at the end of the day as L&D practitioners, as people working in the field. And that is what is so exciting about it. And the thing that's scary about that is that people, as I mentioned, who leverage AI in a way that is unethical, just really go against that moral principle there.
Correct.
I think that just allowing us to embrace technology to, to really enhance the human experience is really, I think, where it's at the end of the day.
Well, and I think that's where, as learning professionals, we have an opportunity to, when I look at some of the things, when we really talk about what personalization looks like, which is, and we joked about this backstage, right now, a lot of what we see AI being used for personalization is like the equivalent. I think you said it. If you told your kids, I like yellow, and then your kid, everything they do is colored yellow. They bring you pictures of yellow. Every birthday present you have is yellow, because it took this one comment that you just happened to mention in passing, and it took that as, oh, Helen loves yellow. Everything she loves must be yellow, type of a thing. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a lot of what we're seeing right now, when really the capability to use artificial intelligence to better understand, where is someone right now? What are they doing? What do they actually need in this moment? What do they not need? How do I adapt based on what we talked about with the community piece? You might just be having a really bad day, and something that yesterday would have knocked it out of the park for you
Mm-hmm.
today may set you off and make you have a horrible day at work. And its capability to move at the speed of recognizing that and being able to adapt to you, that's huge in terms of what it can do to bring out the best in you, to develop you in ways that you didn't even realize you needed developing. That's phenomenal when I look at the future, but it all goes back to, how do we choose to use it?
And I think there's a real opportunity there to allow AI to instigate connection with information that we might not we just hadn't necessarily thought about at that stage. I know Josh Burson's just released his AI and HR report, which was a really interesting read. A lot of it was way over my head from a tech perspective, but there was a really interesting chapter around AI and skills, and he was talking there around AI being able to not only identify the skills that you have as an individual, using terminology that you might not necessarily have recognized yourself, because skills terminology is really tricky to pin down and to know
Most
exactly
people
what you
don't
mean.
understand it. They
Yeah,
really
I don't
don't.
think anyone's really got that right. And so AI can be useful in that perspective, but then it's also connecting you with other skills that uncovering skills that you don't necessarily know that you have, but you actually do have. So providing terminology, connecting you to the skills that or making you aware of skills that you might not necessarily have known you had.
Yep.
And then there's another layer of that is then connecting you with skills that you might want to develop in order to head in this trajectory towards this goal. And that's really exciting stuff, I think, when we look at
Yes.
AI and the opportunity for skills development specifically.
Yeah. Its ability, or the potential, at least potential, because this is where there's a lot of checks being written right now that I'm not confident people are going to be able to cash, but its potential to be able to give people language and eyes to see things and words to speak things that they didn't even realize they had is phenomenal. And that's a very bright future. It's a very
Yeah.
bright future, but it's one that yet remains to be unseen. So
Mhm. Mhm.
anyway, Well, this was super fun, Helen. I really enjoyed this conversation. I know this was at the very end of your day after a very long day. So hopefully it was as engaging and energetic as you had set out
Yeah,
for.
it definitely was. And I'm just going to say, for anyone thinking about that yellow piece and saying, dropping into conversation with your parents or your children, yeah, I like this, and then getting it as presents for the rest of your your
Your
life.
life.
I'm just going to say, I like donuts, and if anyone wants to buy me donuts, there we go.
Okay.
That's not a
Okay.
trick.
So there you go. So now you know that, in a good way, one thing we can know about Helen, about her as a human, is she loves donuts, and that's not going to change. There's
And
not going to
AI
come a
is not going
day
to
where
change that. No.
no, AI is not going to change that. I love it. What a great way to end. Well, thank you so much, Helen, for joining me. Thanks everyone for watching and listening. Hopefully this makes you think deeper and go further with where you see the future of development and growth for the employees you serve ahead. So thanks so much, Helen.
Thanks so much for having me.